Hi students, it's Dr. Marks, and we're going to talk about the pillars of sustainable development and sustainability. Now you've probably heard me refer to these before, so let's just jump right in. We've got sustainability based on three pillars. First, the environmental pillar. Second, the economic pillar. And third, the social, or sometimes it's called the social justice pillar. So we have three pillars: environmental, economic, and social or social justice. But I want to impress upon you that there's no universal definitions, and you could read a whole bunch of different resources and they'll explain things in very different ways. The second thing I want to impress upon you is that most of the focus when you do your reading is going to be on business or corporate sustainability. And by that, we're talking about what can businesses or what can firms do to make themselves more sustainable. But there's less focus on what sustainability looks like for a country. For example, Costa Rica. We want to think about country level, and that's going to require us to think outside the box just a little bit. You've probably seen these diagrams before. They represent the three pillars: environment, economic, and social, and each one of them has a slightly different interpretation, and we're not going to get into that now because what we really want to do is dive into the pillars. Let's start with the environmental pillar. When we think about sustainability for a business, for firms, we're talking about a commitment to protecting the environment. And in that, there are things that a business can do to protect the environment. They can recycle. They can focus on green energy. They can reduce their waste. They can start thinking about measuring and lowering their carbon footprint. So at Longwood, which is essentially a business, we've done some of these things. For example, for years we've been generating our own heat in a sustainable way, burning sawdust. We have green certified buildings. For example, the gym is LEED certified. We've created this wastewater facility that you may have seen housing some ducks. And years ago, we moved to a trayless dining hall because the research showed that food waste was much lower when people didn't have trays. If we want to think about the environmental pillar for a nation, we have to think a little bit differently. Again, same commitment to reducing stress on the environment, just like a business would have, and still the idea of using resources wisely. They might be thinking about minimizing their waste and their pollution, just like a business. But they might have bigger picture things they have to think about. For example, water quality, air quality. They might need to be protecting land, establishing reserves. They have to think about climate change. When we think about environmental sustainability, we have overlap clearly between what a nation would need to be thinking about and what a business itself would need to think about. But again, there's going to be some really dramatic differences. So back to the idea of what can a nation do? Well, Costa Rica has done things that we see businesses do. Costa Rica has a system of green certifications. A hotel can take certain measures and become green certified in their green leaf system. But they've also looked at some bigger pictures through things like their ban on deforestation, their bans on hunting, their reforestation effort, their establishment of reserves. They've had to manage their natural resources in a way that helps promote ecotourism and gives them economic growth for the long run. Let's move on to talk about the economic pillar. For businesses, when we think about the economic pillar, again, we've got to be thinking about efficient use of resources, because when you don't use your resources efficiently, you're wasting money. We want to think about in the context of long-term profitability. So let's come up with ways we use our resources that leads to long-term profitability. You might also be thinking about how to limit risks to the environment that are posed by the production process, right? Not all production processes are perfectly clean. Probably most of them are not. So how do you reduce the risks to the environment that come from your particular processes in place for production? But for a nation, we might be thinking about development and economic growth, because that's going to be important when we think about sustainability in the economic sense. But You need development and economic growth in a way that also protects the environment. And as we've probably discussed before, we don't have these at odds with each other. We understand that you can have economic development and economic growth while also protecting the environment. It doesn't have to be one or the other. We want to be thinking about increasing standards of living and improving opportunities for citizens and making investments that enhance productivity. So countries can do those things like invest in human capital. So what has Costa Rica been doing in the economic pillar? Well, we see this huge investment in human capital because they've made education free, and they've also invested in English instruction so that they can have a bilingual community. They've increased access to healthcare, and now they have national healthcare where it's provided to all. And these things all increase economic security of their citizens. We also know that they have been increasing their participation in trade and global trade agreements, and that, of course, also propels economic growth. Let's move on to the social or social justice pillar. Since not everyone's familiar with the idea of social justice, we'll start by defining that. When we think about social justice, we're talking about upholding the right of all without discrimination to a social environment supportive of human dignity. Now that's a little abstract for my brain, but upholding the right of all without discrimination to a social environment supportive of human dignity. And this includes respecting social diversity. And we need to ensure that we put a priority on social capital. So there's some new concepts probably for some of you. Let's make sure you understand what we mean when we say put a priority on social capital. What does that mean? What exactly is social capital? Social capital is the active connections between people. And when we think about these active connections between people, we're talking about behaviors that bind people together. It could be the groups, the networks, communities, but whatever connections between people that are going to make cooperation possible. And so you could probably imagine that without this social capital, it would be really difficult to accomplish any of your objectives. Add on to that, we're talking about norms and relations in social structures that enable people to coordinate action to achieve desired goals. So guys, if you have a society where people are completely unconnected to each other, there are no behaviors that bind them together, if there's no groups or networks that allow them to more easily cooperate and coordinate, then there's not going to be a chance that they can achieve any of their desired goals. So for businesses, if we're thinking about social and social justice, we might be talking about respect for individual rights, and that means you need to have an attitude of equity, you need to reduce social inequalities, but it can also extend beyond those things. You could be supportive of fair trade that focuses on sustainable agriculture. Maybe you're a company that has to source inputs to your production. And so supporting sustainable agriculture through fair trade would be one way of doing that. At the same time, you need to foster a safe workplace. If we're talking about a nation, social justice might look similar in some of the ways. We want gender parity, just like firms do, right? You don't want there to be any gender discrimination. But this might manifest itself for a country in terms of something like access to education, and especially in relation to gender equity. We know that there are countries where the probability that a girl gets an education is a lot lower than the probability that a boy gets an education. So gender parity, specifically in terms of access to education, but also a social issue is going to be access to healthcare. You could be talking about things like disability rights or equity of income and how income is distributed, or eco-justice. And if you've never heard the term NIMBY, NIMBY stands for, it's the acronym for not in my backyard. So eco-justice issues are going to be those things that are inherent unfairnesses. It could, for example, in our community here, be where are we going to locate a dump? Is it likely to be placed in a richer area Or do we often find them in poor communities where people don't have as much of a voice, where land is cheaper? Those are eco-justice types of ideas. We also need to think about corporate accountability, making corporations in your country responsible and holding them accountable. So what has Costa Rica done? Well, you're going to see in Costa Rica disability access. They've promoted education for all, health care for all. And of course, while we're there, we need to look for other examples of where we see sustainability in connection to the social or social justice pillars. So let's be on the lookout. There's also some mention of a fourth pillar, depending on what scholars' materials you're reading. And that fourth pillar is culture. Culture helps to support the other pillars. In other words, it plays a facilitating role in helping nations meet their objectives. Companies can have a culture, so you can imagine some companies might have a culture that really appeals to you. There might be other companies that have a culture that doesn't appeal to you. But countries can also have a culture, and the culture is going to have a lot to do with how successful efforts are going to be. And Costa Rica is a great example of this. Let's talk about applying the pillars, because we can take an issue, any issue, and discuss it in relation to the three different pillars. And you might be asked to do this. So let's take an example and let's flush it out in relation to the three pillars. So let's specifically talk about deforestation in Costa Rica. And what we want to do is discuss it in relation to how it connects to the three different pillars of sustainability. Let's start with the environmental pillar. Well, if we're thinking about deforestation in Costa Rica with respect to the environmental pillar, we might point out that forests are really important to the environment, right? Forests are considered to be the lungs of the world. They produce oxygen and they absorb the carbon. They help regulate temperatures and they help fight against global warming. So forests are going to be especially important. And when we cut them down, we're really creating a lot of environmental damage. But on top of that, it provides habitats for species, and we could have the future cures and medicines for things like cancer in the rainforest. Now let's think about what might connect to the economic pillar. If we were evaluating the economic pillar, we might first point out that those people living in rainforests tend to be lower income. Well, what does that have to do with it? Well, if you're in an area that's low income, a living tree in the rainforest has no economic value, of course, unless it's providing some kind of food or fruit. But if it's not, that living tree has no economic value, but dead trees, they do. Think about it. I'm trying to meet my basic needs, and my basic needs are cooking and fuel. We might also talk about the incentives that were provided by government that promote development. We know that in Costa Rica, government was giving away land. They were encouraging people to develop. How do you get the land? By chopping down the trees and developing it. And of course, that leads to increased rates of deforestation. Why did they do that? Again, another economic reason, government's desire to expand exports. And so governments have created short-term economic benefits, but at the risk of long-term sustainability and environmental health. Finally, let's talk about the social pillar. And this one is the pillar that's the most challenging for students to talk about and make the connections to. So we could go back to poverty, right? We've talked about that in the economic pillar, but that's also related to the social pillar, that we understand that poverty is a contributing factor when we think about destruction of forests. And this stems from income inequality, and income inequality is clearly going to be a social issue. So we could ask ourselves the question, how can we create access to opportunities for people that live in poverty or live in these forested rural areas where they don't see the kinds of opportunities you would have in the city? We could tie this into what we see in Costa Rica with development and deforestation bans, and that in and of itself might not be a social pillar element, but when we ask the question, is it fair to tell people how to use their land? Are we creating unfairness? Are we creating more inequity? That probably relates to the social pillar. And finally, we might ask, is it appropriate for developed nations like the United States who deforested, right? We did the same thing in the development of our own cities and clear-cutted for these ranches that take up the Midwest. Is it appropriate for developed nations who had some fairly unsustainable activities to have a say in what happens in places like Costa Rica and other countries around the world? These are all elements that we can connect to the social pillar. So to recap, we have 3 pillars that support sustainability, and you need to be familiar with those 3 pillars, be able to explain them, and be able to apply those 3 pillars to any specific scenario, just like we did with deforestation in Costa Rica. If you have any questions, please let me know. I thank you for listening, and I hope you have a fantastic day.